Good evening, my dear friends. I hope you're all doing very well. Tonight we're going to be learning chapter 17 in the laws of Shabbat, where we're going to be learning about a pathway in regards to a lane if we're allowed to carry within it on Shabbat. So what we're talking about essentially is two different options. Either we're talking about two walls where you have a space to go and people are walking through it, and it's in a residential area, but it's not actually part of someone's property. It's just between two buildings, and now you want to make this in-between area also to be allowed to carry there on Shabbat. Then another option is if it's actually a pathway, but it's a dead end. So in other words, it's enclosed on three sides. So you have two buildings with a dead end. It's closed off at the end with another wall. So you have three walls, and now you want to carry within this. It's not a courtyard, it's a pathway, but you still want to carry within it on Shabbat. So what would it be to make this closed lane that is three-walled? How would we make that allowed to be carried on Shabbat? There are two ways. Either make a roof, put some sort of roof over it, well then, that would be considered good enough to make it into a closed area and to make this as part of a private domain so that we should be able to carry there on Shabbat. Another option would be, as the rabbi said, that we can put a pole in the place of the fourth wall, which is missing. There is no fourth wall, but where the place where the fourth wall should be, you put a pole over there, and that pole would be considered as the beginning of the fourth wall, and then we will be able to carry there on Shabbat. Now, in regards to a lane or a path, which is an actual path, you're going through it all the way, there's only two walls. So, what you're allowed to do on Shabbat is to make each one of the two sides into a doorway. In other words, if there is this pathway and you make it into a doorway on each side, well then a doorway is allowed to be one of the walls of a private domain. So, as we know, as you already learned, a doorway consists of three important components: two sides and one top. So we need to have two posts and then a third post going over, and that would make it to be considered as a doorpost on Shabbat. So to be able to carry through it. And since it's a doorway, even if it's very wide, we will be able to carry, and it will be considered as a door, and you can go and carry through this area on Shabbat. And then within one of the doorways, you would put a pole over there as in incorporating this extra wall in order to show that it's the beginning of a wall, and then you would be totally fine in regards to Shabbat. All of this is all in a regular case where this pathway is the same height and is in the same level as the public domain in where you're coming from. So you're coming off the road, you're going into this pathway, you want to get to the buildings, and that's how you go through. So you would have to do this. But in a case where it's either higher up, you've got to go up a couple stairs, or it's lower down, in such a case, it would actually not need any of these components. We wouldn't have to make it into a doorway, we wouldn't have to put an extra pole, we wouldn't have to make a roof, because, as we already learned, if somewhere which is higher than 10 cubits, or somewhere which is lower than 10 cubits of the public domain is going to actually be a domain for itself, and ultimately, this would be considered a private domain in any case, and we would be able to carry there on Shabbat, since it is a domain for itself, away from, on a different level of height than the public domain. So to also, if this path finishes off at the ocean, then we would not have this problem, and it would be considered as an area for itself to be able to carry there on Shabbat. Now, the Rambam continues, and he says that what are we talking about in regards to adding the pole or so on and so forth? This would all be in a case when there are buildings, there are houses, there are places where people live that are opening up into this path. But if it is an area which is just a place where people don't live, it's two walls, So then this would not be enough just to put a pole or so on. You would actually have to build a wall to close it up, to make it into an actual area to be able to carry there on Shabbat, since no one lives there. There is no house opening up into this area. And it also, in order to be considered a path or a lane, it would have to be narrow and long. So if it is square or so on and so forth, so then that would not be considered a lane. This is a special law in regards to a lane, to a path, which works in this case. A courtyard has a different type of law. It works in a different setup. If this lane is extremely narrow, that it doesn't actually even have 3 handbreadths, so a handbreadth is just about this big, as we're going to be learning at the end of the chapter. So 3 of these, if this path is narrower than literally a foot, then you don't have to do anything, because it is just considered as if it's totally closed off, since the 2 walls are so close to each other, and it would not be a problem. So, now in regards to if you have 2 walls that are in a public domain. So we spoke about earlier, when it's within a private domain, how you can just put up an extra pole or a roof and so on. It's going to become like a private area. What about it within a public area where there isn't, and not necessarily is it a place where people are living? It's just outside. How can you make this to be an area that you can carry on Shabbat? So he says, you make doors. On each side of the opening, you make doors. Well, since there are doors, so then it makes it to be considered as a private area. I mean, it's a door, you can close it, you can lock these doors. So even if you don't actually lock the doors, but since you are able to lock the doors, you're able to close these doors and make it into a private domain, so to speak, so then we will be able to carry there on Shabbat, even though you don't actually close and lock these doors at night. You're not using it as a house, but since it has the potential of being a house, of being an abode, so therefore, of being a private domain, so therefore it would work. But just to make a doorway or to put an extra pole, that wouldn't work in a public domain. Then the Rambam continues on in the next couple laws over here, and he talks about various details in more specific cases. And they are actually very complicated laws. If you want to see it more at length and more in detail, I do suggest you open up a book of Rambam and you look at chapter 17. The whole bulk of the middle of the chapter is all these different cases where he talks about various length, various situations where it can get very complicated. And just to keep it to the point, we're going to pass over these complications. He goes on to towards the end of the chapter, he goes on to a slightly different concept where you have a well, which is in the center, and you have created walls that look just like this. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4. So you have 4 walls, but each one is it's 2 halves. And then another 2 halves over here, and you have 4 entryways coming into it, right? So you have corners, these little bracket walls all around, and the well is in the center. So technically speaking, the Rambam says that this would be considered as a wall around this well to be able to draw water from this well into this area on Shabbat, because the problem is to take the water on Shabbat would be an issue if you're in a public domain. So therefore you want to have it in a private domain. So you build these little walls, these little bracket walls around this area. The thing is like this. The Rambam says that even in a case where these bracket walls are less than the amount that there is no wall, in other words, there is more no wall than there is wall, meaning, again, the brackets are only a small portion of the circumference of this box around this well, still it will be considered like a private property in regards to here. And since they're all standing independently, we would be able to come and pull out water, and so the animals can come and drink, and so on and so forth within this area. But because it's considered a private area, so therefore you're not allowed to take from this out into the public domain, which is outside of these walls. Similarly, you can take from outside and bring them into here. So that's another idea in regards to taking an open space and making it into a more private domain where you should be able to carry on Shabbat. And this law in regards to these bracket walls was only allowed, and Rambam says they were only permitted in the land of Israel for the sake of the animals, in regards when the people were going to the festive pilgrimage to coming up to Jerusalem. But in other places, but in other areas, for other reasons, we should obviously build a normal wall around the well to be able to use. And it's not a regular case on a regular day that you should be able to use this. So it's a very interesting thing. And this would basically mean that if you have a well practically on Shabbat, if you have a well which is in a public area and you want to drink water from there, so you want to take out from the well, draw up water, and drink it, even if you're standing right near the well, the problem is that you're taking it from the well domain and bringing it out into the public domain. So therefore, you actually have to build a good wall which is 10 cubits high, so that you should be able to bring it and be within this wall, and the well should be within this little property, and you draw the water and you drink it over there. And therefore also, if someone is going to throw something from there into the area of the well, they would be liable because it is going into another property. And the Rambam finishes off this chapter by explaining a couple of the terminologies that we've been using over here over the last couple chapters. The idea of a finger breadth. So he says that one finger breadth is the width of a thumb. So one thumb is a finger breadth. So not your pinky, but rather your thumb. That is the size of a finger breadth. A hand breadth is the size of 4 finger breadths. So if this is 1 finger breadth, then 4 finger breadth would be just about a full fist, because your pinky is not as wide as your thumb, so it's going to be just about your full finger, your full fist. And whenever we're talking about a hand breadth, so that's going to be this is 1 hand breadth. I'm sorry. So when we're talking about cubits, so we have fingers, we have hand breadths, and we have cubits, which, or another term is arm breadths. Cubits are 6 hand breadths. Okay, so we have 3 measurements over here. The Rambam tells us. One is a finger breadth, which is 1 finger, 1 thumb. One is a hand breadth, which is the size of 4 thumbs. And one is a cubit, which in Hebrew is called an amah, which is a arm breadth, and that is the size of 6 hand breadths. Alright, so it's 6 fists together. That makes out the size of a cubit. So, on Shabbat, we're going to bump into these various numbers, these various measurements. He gives us this down pat so we should know what we're talking about when we're using this system of Shabbat, of counting in regards to the laws of Shabbat, and in other places as well, wherever it might play itself out. So that is the chapter for today, chapter 17, learning about the laws of these paths or areas which are maybe in a more public domain, and we're trying to make them more into a private domain on Shabbat. And that is it for today. We will see you all tomorrow.